Scroll through millennial TikTok and you'll see endless videos about boomer parents who never said sorry, who weaponized silent treatment, who treated therapy like a personal failing. But there's a quieter group of millennials sitting in those comments thinking, that wasn't my house at all. That wasn't even close. And psychologically, they're unlike any other millennial cohort that's been studied. If you were born somewhere between the late 80s and mid-90s, and your parents are Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980, your psychology is genuinely different from the typical millennial profile that researchers keep writing about. You got a parenting style that barely existed before and barely exists since. And the way it shaped you might actually explain why you've always felt slightly off from your own generation, why their problems sound a little dramatic to you, and their solutions sound a little obvious. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Most millennials were raised by boomers, and boomer parenting had a very specific texture: stoic, achievement-focused, emotionally distant in ways that have spawned an entire therapy-speak vocabulary online. By the time the youngest millennials were arriving, helicopter parenting had taken over from the other direction. Tracking apps, scheduled playdates, kids whose entire week was managed by an adult. But Gen X parents did something different, almost on instinct. They were the original latchkey kids. They came home to empty houses at age 8, let themselves in, made themselves a snack, and figured out their own afternoons. They knew exactly what felt cold about that. But they also watched their boomer peers smother their own kids with attention, and they knew what felt suffocating about that. So they tried something almost no parenting book in 1995 had a name for: present, but not hovering; tough, but emotionally available; hands off the small stuff; hands on the things that actually mattered. Psychologist Diana Baumrind began publishing research in 1971 that identified distinct parenting styles: authoritarian, permissive, and the rare middle path she called authoritative. Authoritative parenting combined high warmth with high standards, clear rules, consistent consequences, real conversations about why something mattered, not just what the rule was. Decades of follow-up research found that kids raised this way scored higher on emotional regulation, academic outcomes, and adult resilience than any other parenting style measured. Researcher Lawrence Steinberg's longitudinal work through the 1990s tracked thousands of adolescents into adulthood and found that authoritative parenting predicted better mental health outcomes well into early adulthood, regardless of family income. The Gen X parenting wave that emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s drifted toward authoritative parenting at a scale no previous parenting cohort had reached. They weren't reading Baumrind, they weren't trying to be psychologists. They were just trying to do the opposite of two things they'd lived through, and the result happened to land on what researchers had quietly been calling the gold standard for decades. Picture this. It's 1999. You're 9 years old, riding your bike in loops around the cul-de-sac until the streetlights flick on. Nobody is texting you because you don't have a phone. Nobody knows exactly where you are because the only way to know would be to drive over and check. You skin your knee on the curb, decide it's not bad enough to mention, and keep going. When you finally come home, your mom is making dinner. She looks at you and asks how it went. Not what you did, not who you were with. How it went. That single question is the entire signature of Gen X parenting in one sentence. It assumed you'd had your own day. It assumed you'd processed your own feelings. And it left a small open door for you to walk through, if you wanted to. But here's where it gets interesting. Those unsupervised hours weren't deprivation. They were unintentional emotional regulation training. When you're 9 and you skin your knee with no adult around to perform distress to, your nervous system has to actually regulate itself. Research on autonomy in childhood, going back decades, consistently shows that kids granted age-appropriate independence develop a stronger internal locus of control. Translation: you grew up believing you could handle things because you'd been quietly handling things since you were small. But there's more going on than just independence. Gen X parents, having grown up in households where adults rarely apologized, often went the opposite direction. They said sorry when they snapped. They admitted when they didn't know something. They told you when work was bad and they were stressed. You got modeled emotional accountability at a developmental window when most kids were learning the opposite. Which is exactly why so many millennials raised by Gen X end up being the friend everyone goes to when they need a hard conversation handled gently. And here's the kicker. You inherited the Gen X skepticism toward authority, but filtered it through millennial emotional fluency. You can sit in a meeting and clock instantly that the person leading it has no idea what they're doing, but you can also, unlike your Gen X parents, have a thoughtful conversation about it afterward without making it weird, without going scorched earth, without burning the bridge. You distrust titles, you trust competence, you can name both, calmly. And this shows up in ways you might not even notice. Gen X parents told their kids the truth. Money is hard. Adult relationships are hard. Some people don't get better. Most millennial therapy content right now is about unlearning toxic positivity. You probably didn't have to. You were handed realistic optimism in early childhood, the genuine belief that life is hard and also worth it. That's a worldview most of your peers are paying $180 an hour to find their way back to in their 30s. There's also the dark humour. Your family dinners had irony in them. Your parents made jokes about their own jobs, their own bosses, their own bad decisions. You learned early that you can name something painful and laugh at it in the same breath. Researchers call this adaptive humour, and it correlates with lower rates of depression in adulthood. It's not cynicism, it's a coping mechanism that actually works. Now, let's be honest, not every Gen X parent landed in the authoritative sweet spot. Some leaned too far into the absence they'd grown up with, calling it free range when it was really just disengaged. Some got the warmth right but skipped the structure entirely. If your version of this was lonelier than warm, or more chaotic than steady, that's real, and the reframe doesn't apply the same way. But for the millennials whose Gen X parents got it right, here's what you actually carry. You have the emotional vocabulary of a millennial and the self-reliance of someone raised in a Gen X afternoon. You can have a hard conversation without flinching, but you can also entertain yourself for hours with no phone if you have to. You can sit through a setback without making it your whole personality. You're not avoidant. You're not enmeshed. You sit somewhere in the middle that most psychology books haven't quite named yet. That's why you've always felt slightly out of step with the rest of your generation. The therapy speak millennials sound a little dramatic to you. The completely unbothered Gen Xers sound a little cold. You can speak both languages fluently, and you've been quietly translating between them at every job, every friend group, every family table since you were a teenager. There's an honest reason this group hasn't been written about much yet. They're hard to see. They don't post about their childhood the way other millennials do because the boomer parent grievance genre doesn't really apply to them. They don't post about being raised right either because Gen X parents trained them out of performing wellness in any form, so they just walk around carrying this quietly useful inheritance, fluent in 2 emotional languages, comfortable in a kind of independence that doesn't look like loneliness, capable of irony without bitterness. If the world keeps trying to label millennials as anxious, depressed, or burned out, and none of those words quite fit when applied to you, this is probably why. You are a millennial. You're also, quietly, something else. You're not the soft millennial. You're not the hardened Gen X kid either. You're somewhere in between, fluent in both, fitting cleanly in neither. And that in between isn't a problem. It's the whole point. It's actually the inheritance. If this resonated, you'll probably connect with the psychology of people who can read a room before they even walk into it, and why that ability is almost always misread as anxiety when it's actually something much rarer. Click one of these videos. There's more about you that nobody's quite named yet.